how about we have a little discussion about desert temples? These are some of my absolute favorite dungeons in Zelda. I don't even know why, I'm always drawn to the desert dungeons in Zelda. Probably because they have the best track record of any type of dungeon in the series. But in this video, I'm going to be going over the desert temples that I have personally played through, so nothing from A Link Between Worlds or Skyward Sword will show up in this video. Without further ado, let's get into our first dungeon. This is my Desert Dungeon Retrospective. Ah yes, the final temple in Ocarina of Time, and it's an absolute gem. First off, the idea of having a child side and an adult side was extremely well implemented. This concept alone made it a great final temple. And come on, let's not forget the music. Probably the most fitting musical theme of any area in general in all of Zelda. This temple truly feels like a dusty, unearthed relic, and the music is a big part of that. There's also a sense of reverence inside the Spirit Temple, something that's not easily achieved by other dungeons. And that vista you get when you step outside onto the hands of the goddess is breathtaking and is pretty mind-blowing for an N64 game. This dungeon includes a lot of fun puzzles, especially the silver rupee collecting puzzles and the mirror puzzles. The mirrors were so much fun to turn and use as reflectors, and I thought that whole mirror room was just utterly genius. I loved how you needed to get the light to reflect below so that you could scorch off the face of the goddess statue with the mirror shield. And speaking of the mirror shield, it's one of those items that gets put to good use inside of the dungeon, but not so much outside of the dungeon. So yeah, I do wish that the mirror shield had more uses outside of the Spirit Temple, but hey, it's still a great item. The Iron Knuckle mini-bosses were great, and Naboris being sealed inside of one was quite the twist and made for a dramatic fight, because you kinda didn't want to kill one of your friends, you know? I also love when she realizes that she doesn't have her axe and has to snap to get it to appear. That was pretty funny. That was clever. Alright, so we eventually Indiana Jones our way to the final boss, Twinrova. Twinrova felt like a very mature boss fight for a number of reasons, including but not limited to the very suggestive wink the two crusty old cougars give Link, and the fact that Link turns out to be a woman beater. Besides all that, the boss puts the mirror shield to use in a very interesting fashion with, I guess, a magic storing property that the shield possesses that nobody knew about until this boss fight and were probably confused by. Anyway, it was quite fun being able to give these two a taste of their own medicine, and I'm sure they were quite offended that it wasn't prune flavored. Fire against ice was a neat concept and worked really well, and once you beat the two creeps, their little banter as they slowly ascend to the heavens was pretty hilarious. What a dungeon. In summation, what I liked about the dungeon was the use of both child and adult Link, the unmatched atmosphere, the sheer number of puzzles, the item, and the enemies, including the boss. What I did not like about this dungeon was, what? Actually nothing. That's right, this is what I would call a perfect Zelda dungeon. Now, it's not my favorite Zelda dungeon of all time, but it is what I consider a perfect dungeon. It has everything. The Desert Palace from A Link to the Past, also known as the most needlessly difficult to find dungeon in existence. This dungeon is the outlier for me when it comes to desert dungeons, as I almost didn't enjoy anything about it. As I said, it was difficult to find in the overworld, and this just made it all the more disappointing when I finally found the dungeon after about 12 ice-draining hours and was handed this linear, boring piece of crap dungeon. I mean, seriously, you want to talk about linear? This dungeon is the definition of linear. You go from room 1 to room 2 to room 3 to room 4 and so on. I mean, you make a big circle. The enemies aren't very assorted, the item is useful later on but not so much in dungeon, and the puzzles were virtually non-existent. The Desert Palace, which would be more accurately described as the Desert Latrine, was almost strictly a combat dungeon, offering little in the way of critical thinking or thought in general. I will say, there was one part of playing through this dungeon I liked, and that was when you actually got to leave the dungeon for about 5 seconds, but my joy at this moment was squandered when I realized I had to go back into this bland, tedious existence of a palace. The boss fight with the 3 ℕ𝕒𝕗𝕚𝕚 was not exciting, but at least it was kind of hard. It required a few very basic brain functions to defeat, I will give it that. Also, the ℕ𝕗𝕚𝕚 really reminded me of the killer worm from that old Flash game called Effing Worms. Only OGs will remember it. Yeah, it reminds me of that killer worm from that game. Yep, bad dungeon. Terrible dungeon. In summation, what I liked about the dungeon was the 5-second reprieve from the linearity, and admittedly, the item was actually decent, the Power Glove. What I didn't like was the lack of puzzles, the difficulty level being insultingly low, and of course, the linearity. Alright, so after covering my least favorite desert dungeon, we now come to my personal favorite desert dungeon, Arbiter's Grounds. This is the single most creepy place in Twilight Princess, and for many reasons. It's dark, there are screaming banshee-like pose, creepy crawlies, creepy statues, skulls and bones laying everywhere, off-putting music, and the entire backstory to Arbiter's Grounds gives me the heebie-jeebies. Arbiter's Grounds, much like the Shadow Temple in Ocarina of Time, was once used to house and execute criminals. In addition to this, there are also many other nods to Ocarina of Time in Arbiter's Grounds that I really appreciated. For instance, you have the 4 pose like you had in Ocarina of Time's Forest Temple, and you have a statue of the Goddess of the Sand from Ocarina of Time's Desert Colossus. It's little nods like this that make Arbiter's Grounds feel oddly comforting, while also being as creepy as can be. What adds to that creepy factor too is all the undead enemies. Redeads make their Twilight Princess debut here, as well as Stalfos, Staltroops, and Bubbles. Then you have poison mites, which are little insects that crawl all over you. These mites reminded me of that scene in the movie Mummy, where those scarabs start crawling underneath people's skin. Yeah, it was disturbing. Anyway, this dungeon has many moving parts, both figuratively and literally once you get the dungeon item, the spinner. You get the spinner after beating Death's Sword, who I think is the coolest mini-boss in all of Zelda. The spinner gets used a ton in this dungeon. There's even a whole room built just for the spinner that I like to call the roller coaster room. And yes, it is as fun as it sounds. Using the spinning top to scale the spiraling architecture is a thrill. You also use it to move underground gears that raise platforms. Star-Lord is the boss of Arbiter's Grounds, and the fight with him is an extremely satisfying end to the dungeon. Now, there are 2 stages to this boss. The first stage is using the spinner to knock out Star-Lord's vertebrae. While doing this, however, you have to dodge the Staltroops that block your path, adding another dimension to the fight that was absolutely amazing. The second and final stage, while not as fun as the first stage in my opinion, was still a blast. You basically have to hit Star-Lord in the head with your spinner as you jump from rail to rail, and once you knock him to the ground, you can then slash him in the head with your sword. You do this a few times, and then the fight is sadly over. It is a real shame that this boss fight doesn't last very long, as it is one of the most exhilarating parts of any Zelda game. In summation, what I liked about the dungeon was the creepy atmosphere, puzzles and enemies, mini-boss, item, and boss. What I did not like was the shortness of the boss, and that's really it. I mean, this dungeon hit it out of the park for me. Alright, so out of the 4 divine beasts in Breath of the Wild, I and many others would say that Naboris is far and away the best one. While it's far from being a traditional Zelda dungeon, it does feel like the most traditional dungeon in the entire game, mainly due to its scope, length, and difficulty. Getting to Naboris was an absolute blast. You felt like you were a TIE fighter on one of those sand seals, taking down a walker on Tatooine. The dungeon is comprised of a massive main room with multiple rotating segments and the 2 large camel humps. Getting the various sections of that rotating room to line up just right takes a good bit of concentration, especially when mapping your path to each terminal. As for the 2 humps of the camel, I liked that you could see outside through the tops of them. It was really nice to get that extra high view of the desert. I also liked that each hump had its own elevator, and there was even a 3rd elevator that led up into the camel's head. All these elevators made this place feel like a posh 5-star hotel. I'm surprised there weren't mini guardians standing around offering Link room service or a stack of warm towels or something. The theme of electricity ties into the dungeon nicely and makes for some very interesting puzzles. Although to this day I've still never solved this particular puzzle properly. I always beat it by lining up a bunch of metal weapons, and I won't even embarrass myself telling you how long that takes me. So, you're at the end of the dungeon, and you think you'll be getting some kind of wimpy Blight Ganon that just kinda limps his way out into the open, and you'll beat him within 2 minutes like you normally do the Blight Ganons. As you well know, this is not the case, and we end up getting the most difficult boss of the entire game. Now, this isn't only the most difficult boss in the game, but also the most fun. I remember being legitimately stunned by how quickly Thunderblight Ganon moves around. I mean, he might as well be teleporting, he goes so fast. I probably died a good 6 times before beating him my first go around, and yet I couldn't be mad. The dude's got wheels. I mean, you gotta respect his hustle game. I absolutely adored the way Magnesis was used in this fight too, using it as a way to bring down his own metal spikes on him. That was just satisfying, man. Overall, a pretty great dungeon, even if it wasn't very traditional. In summation, what I liked about this dungeon was the difficulty level, the electricity puzzles, and the boss fight. What I did not like about the dungeon was the abhorrent lack of butler mini guardians standing around to tell Link when the 3 Michelin star restaurant opens its hump seating. We have arrived at the final dungeon I'll be discussing in this video. There is so much to say about this dungeon, I almost don't even know where to start. I guess I'll begin with the fact that each of Link's transformations gets used within it, making for a rather hard and long dungeon. Like, seriously, this dungeon takes a long time to complete, at least for me. Even just getting up into the main dungeon is a hike. Just like in the Spirit Temple, we get some awesome mirror puzzles. The mirrors in this dungeon acted almost like the mirror shield from Ocarina of Time, in that they're able to trap and amplify energy, something I found to be an interesting role reversal. There were multiple mini-bosses in this temple, and each one fit really nicely. None of them were too hard, but they all still posed enough of a challenge to make the fights worthwhile. I especially liked the fight with Gomez, a Grim Reaper-like monster. Alright, the real showstopper of this temple for me was its ability to flip upside down. It's a very innovative use of space on the cartridge, since they basically doubled the size of the dungeon without actually doubling the size. I loved the theme that came along with the flip dungeon as well, as it added a bit more of an open air and mystical atmosphere. Alright, I'll be straight with you, Twin Mold is not one of my favorite bosses, mainly because their weak spots are a bit too hard to aim for in my opinion, and they have a ton of health, so they take forever to beat. Alright, so in summation, what I liked about this dungeon was the challenge, the mini-bosses, the puzzles, and the music. What I did not like about this dungeon was the final boss. Now, it wasn't the worst final boss, but I didn't like it that much. And I also wasn't a huge fan of the item, the light arrows. I don't know, getting arrows, different types of arrows as an item, it feels kind of lazy. But I understand why they did it, but not my favorite item. You do also get the Giant's Mask, but you get like one chance to use it and it's crap, so I don't like that one either. These are just my personal opinions and thoughts on these dungeons. I'd really love to hear what you guys think about them though, so please drop a comment letting me know. I have many more videos scheduled to come out relatively soon, including multiple Zelda theories. So stay tuned for my future videos, guys, and as always, I thank you for watching. If you feel so inclined as to support a YouTube content creator who spends hours a week researching Zelda content and is also a full-time college student, I would really appreciate it if you'd consider donating to my Buy Me a Coffee account. It'll be linked in the description. Any proceeds at all would really help with buying my college books and paying for my college classes. And would also probably go towards, some stuff for YouTube as well. Maybe a better microphone, better editing software, that kind of thing. And even if you don't donate, I really thank you for considering it.